Rodrigo Vargas was standing under the eave of the gate, with the younger child asleep in his arms and the older boy gripping his leg, when Esperanza opened the door. Welcome to Stories Between Lives. Esperanza Gutierrez was 62 years old and had been living alone since they buried her husband, Don Firm, in the town cemetery 3 years before. The ranch in Michoacan still stood, but the silence inside it was so deep that sometimes Esperanza believed the very walls had absorbed it. That night she wasn't expecting anyone. She hadn't been expecting anything for a very long time. The man was young, but his eyes carried something heavier than his years. Rodrigo Vargas was 38 years old and had been a widower for 8 months. His wife, Alicia, was taken by a fever the town doctor couldn't stop in time. And since then he had raised Sofa, 5, and Mateo, 8, on his own, working the fields of a landowner who paid him barely enough for a week's worth of corn and beans. He was stubborn and he was quiet, and those two things had been enough to keep him going until Gilberto Soles arrived. Gilberto was Elisa's older brother. One Tuesday before dawn, without warning and without asking, he arrived at Rodrigo's home with a notary and 2 witnesses. He carried papers he claimed were from the courthouse. He said Rodrigo couldn't handle the children alone, that neighbors had complained, that the children were at risk. On what you earn, Mr. Vargas, these children are going to grow up in nothing but poverty. Gilberto told him in front of Mateo, who was standing in the bedroom doorway, listening to every word. A neighbor had watched through her curtain and hadn't opened her door. Rodrigo didn't sign anything. Gilberto left, taking with him the bag of clean clothes he'd brought for the children, telling Rodrigo he would return with a judge. That same week, Doa Celia, the neighbor across the way, began to talk. You could hear her by the laundry sink in the churchyard after Mass. Being a widower is one thing, she would murmur, but being stubborn is another. Those children need a woman to care for them. People nodded. Someone carried the gossip to Gilberto, who sent a second letter with even more official seals. Rodrigo held on for 3 more weeks. Mateo stopped eating well. Sofa woke up crying twice a night. Rodrigo sat on the porch with the light out, his ears filled with that silence that isn't peace but the opposite of it. One Wednesday afternoon he went to see Don Aurelio, the oldest man in the neighborhood, the one who knew everyone and everything. He asked if he knew anyone who could give him a hand with the children while he worked. Don Aurelio was quiet for a moment, stroking his mustache. There's a woman on the old road, he said. She's lived alone for years. Her name is Esperanza. She's good people. He said nothing more. Rodrigo had nothing to offer anyone. That afternoon he gathered the children and walked the 3 kilometers of dirt road, with Sofa asleep on his shoulder and Mateo stumbling with exhaustion at his side. And there he was now, hat in hand, carrying that weight that men who have worked their whole lives without asking anything of anyone carry when they finally have to knock on a stranger's door. Esperanza looked at them from the threshold. She looked at the man who held his hat pressed against his chest with both hands. She looked at the sleeping girl on his shoulder and at the boy who watched her with large, dark eyes. Not a child's eyes, but the eyes of someone who has heard things children shouldn't hear. A gentle north wind blew, carrying that mountain cold that in the nights of Michoacan arrives, wrapped in the evening damp. Esperanza said nothing at first. After a long moment she stepped aside and opened the door. It was a small but solid ranch, with adobe walls and a red tile roof that the years had blackened at the corners. The front porch had 2 old chairs and a pot of geraniums that Esperanza watered every morning out of habit more than joy. Inside it smelled of fresh wood smoke, of pot coffee no one had finished drinking, and of something harder to name, of a house that hasn't heard laughter for a long time. Esperanza set water on the table for them. Then she warmed the leftover beans from the midday pot and took out tortillas wrapped in an embroidered cloth napkin. Rodrigo seated the children before sitting down himself. "Thank you," said Mateo before eating, with a formality that in the mouth of an 8-year-old boy sounded like something learned by necessity, and that single word squeezed something in Esperanza's chest. Sofa fell asleep before finishing her plate, her head tilted against her father's arm. Mateo ate slowly and in silence. Rodrigo didn't lift his eyes from the tablecloth. After a long while, he took his hat from his knees and set it on the empty chair beside him. "I can't pay much," he said. "I'm not charging you anything yet," said Esperanza. "First, tell me." And Rodrigo told her. He spoke about the work, about the children, about the notary and Gilberto's letters. He spoke about the sleepless nights and about Mateo, who no longer wanted to go to school since the neighbors had started to whisper. Only at the end, when he mentioned Alicia, did he lower his voice. "She died with her little recipe booklet on the nightstand," he said. "Sofa sometimes kisses it, believing her mother is inside." He swallowed. He went quiet. Then he lifted his eyes. "You live alone, Ciora," he said in barely a voice. "My children need a grandmother. Let us stay." Esperanza didn't answer right away. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the sleeping girl, arms crossed over her chest as if she were carrying the whole world. "God willing," she said at last. "We'll see tomorrow." What Esperanza didn't know yet was that this man and these children were carrying something she had been searching for years, without knowing she was searching for it. That night, she made up a sleeping mat in the back room for Rodrigo and settled the children in the larger bed, with a clean blanket that smelled of lavender. Before putting out the kitchen light, Esperanza sat alone for a moment in her chair. For the first time in 3 years, the silence of the house didn't weigh on her in the same way. From the bedroom came the quiet breathing of Sofa. From the back, the still silence of a man who for the first time in months could close his eyes without being entirely alone in the world. At dawn, Esperanza already had the fire going when Mateo appeared in the hallway in bare feet. He stopped at the kitchen entrance and said nothing. He just looked. "Do you want pot coffee?" Esperanza asked without turning around. "With milk if you have it." She served it with warm milk and added sugar without asking. Mateo sat on the smaller bench and held the clay mug with both hands. Outside, the sun was beginning to rise over the mesquites on the hillside, and the light came in through the window, opening in a long golden line that cut the kitchen in half. The second morning was the same as the first, except that Mateo came to the kitchen alone without anyone calling him. The third morning he arrived with Sofa by the hand, who sat on the other bench and waited with her eyes still half closed for Esperanza to set her little mug of warm milk in front of her. And so that ritual took hold. Rodrigo left before dawn with his hat and his bag to the landowner's fields, and when the sun was just at the mesquites, Esperanza already had the fire lit and the 2 children seated, warming their hands on their mugs, watching the light come in through the window with the quiet patience of people who have found where they belong. She made them breakfast on the griddle, eggs with beans from the pot, sometimes a corn porridge when it was cold, sometimes bread with warm milk because Sofa liked to dip it. Esperanza had already learned exactly how long to leave it in the mug before it fell apart. One morning, Rodrigo was late picking up his bag because Sofa wouldn't let him go. She had clung to his legs at the porch entrance. Rodrigo gently pried her free and whispered something in her ear. Sofa let go. Rodrigo walked off down the dirt road. The girl stood watching toward the mesquites until her father's figure disappeared, and only then went back inside to finish her mug of milk. Esperanza said nothing, She folded the cloth napkin and placed it on the table. It was Sofa who found the doll. It was in the wooden trunk at the foot of the bed in the main room, under a folded blanket and some photographs wrapped in paper. Sofa pulled it out with both hands and hugged it before she quite knew what it was. It was a rag doll, with braided hair of dark brown yarn and a little dress embroidered with yellow flowers, sewn with patience more than 30 years before. Esperanza held it in her hands for a moment when Sofa showed it to her. Her eyes went barely cloudy. She breathed slowly. "Take good care of it," she told her. From that day, the rag doll never left Sofa's side. She brought it to breakfast. She lay it beside her at nap time. Sometimes she sat it on the porch bench, facing the geraniums, as if it too wanted to watch the afternoon sun. The next day, Don Aurelio arrived with half a dozen freshly laid eggs and a bundle of herbs for tea. He left them on the porch without waiting for thanks. "I heard you had good visitors," he said, nothing more, and walked back down the dirt road. Esperanza watched him go and thought that the good old men of the world are the ones who don't ask questions. Rodrigo began fixing things Esperanza had been putting off for months: the broken gate, the drain pipe at the wash basin, a loose hinge on the storehouse door. He did it in the mornings before going to work, without asking anyone's permission. Every night, after the children were asleep, he and Esperanza would sit on the porch with a mug of coffee. Sometimes they talked and sometimes they didn't, and in that shared silence there was already something different from the silence of before. One night, Rodrigo asked her what she used to do before they arrived. Esperanza thought for a moment before answering. "I watered the geraniums," she said, "and I waited without knowing what for." Rodrigo nodded and asked no more questions. That said everything too. One afternoon, Sofa came running in frightened because Mateo had told her the doll had belonged to a dead girl. "I didn't say dead," Mateo defended himself. "I said it belonged to someone who was no longer here." Esperanza looked at them both. "Things kept with love don't die," she said. "They just wait." Sofa considered this for a moment and hugged the doll again. Mateo nodded in silence, with that gravity of his that said more than his 8 years allowed him to name. One afternoon that week, Rodrigo stood in front of the storehouse door with the hammer still in his hand. He closed his eyes for a second. Esperanza saw him from the porch but didn't approach. After a moment, Rodrigo opened his eyes, drove in the last nail, and kept going. That was how he was, with no words that served no purpose. Don Aurelio sent word to Rodrigo through a boy from down the road that Gilberto Soles had been asking around about him in town, that someone had told him where the children were. Rodrigo told Esperanza that night on the porch. She listened without saying anything for a long while. "We are here," she said finally. "And here we stay." But that night, Esperanza was going to read in a photograph something that had been waiting for her for decades without her knowing it. Rodrigo had kept Alicia's photograph in a folded envelope at the bottom of his bag since the day he left his house. That night, after the children were asleep, he took it out and placed it on the table in front of Esperanza. "This is what she looked like," he said. Esperanza picked up the photograph. It was a studio portrait, black and white, with edges slightly bent by time. A young woman, dark-eyed, with a smile that didn't quite reach her lips but that held something of peace inside it. A woman Esperanza had never seen, and yet something in that face tied a knot in her chest she couldn't name. "What was Elisa's mother's name?" she asked slowly. Rodrigo looked at her. "Remedios," he said. "Remedios Soles de Castillo. She died when Elisa was 17. Esperanza let out her breath very slowly. She closed her eyes for a second. Then she rose without a word and went to the trunk in the bedroom. Rodrigo heard the creak of the lid, the rustling of old papers. When Esperanza returned, she was carrying a yellowed envelope in her hands. She set it on the table carefully, as if it were fragile. Remedios Soles was my comadre, she said. We met when I was young, before I came to this ranch. She lived in San Jose del Rincon. I lost track of her when she fell ill. Esperanza unfolded the envelope. Inside were 3 handwritten letters and a small sepia photograph. It showed a young woman holding a baby girl. In the lower corner, in ink blurred by the years, it read, Alicia, 3 months. For my dear comadre Esperanza, with all my love. December 1964. Rodrigo didn't speak. He just looked. When Alicia was born, I sent a gift with someone who was traveling that way. I couldn't go myself. Remedios wrote to thank me. Esperanza paused. I sent a rag doll with braided hair of brown yarn. I made it myself from the fabric of an old shawl. I embroidered the cheeks rose pink with silk thread. Rodrigo raised his eyes. It took him a second to understand. Alisa always had that doll, he said, his voice very low. She always said that a comadre of her mother's had given it to her the day she was born. She kept it wrapped in paper at the bottom of the trunk. He looked toward the dark hallway where the children slept. Sofa found it among her things when we sorted through the house after Alicia died. Esperanza still said nothing. She went to the bedroom, took the rag doll that Sofa had left on the blanket that night, and placed it next to the photograph of Remedios on the table. It took me 30 years to find you, she said, looking at the portrait of Alicia as a baby. And you arrived with your children. A long silence fell over the kitchen. Sofa found an identical doll here, said Esperanza. Remedios asked me to make 2 when Alicia was born, one for her and one for me, so that we would each keep the memory. I never imagined both of them would arrive at the same table. Rodrigo lowered his head. His shoulders moved barely, as if something very old had given way inside him. When he raised his eyes, there was something different in them. Not quite relief yet. Not quite wonder, either. It was that instant that comes just before understanding, when you feel that something enormous has shifted, but you don't yet know in which direction. These children are the grandchildren of my comadre, said Esperanza, more to herself than to him. They are the children of an Alisa I never knew, but whom I loved before she was born. Though neither of them fully understood it yet, that night the ranch in Michoacán began for the first time in many years to be a real home. Gilberto Soles arrived on a Thursday morning when Rodrigo had already left for work. He came with the notary and a man from town who no one knew well. He stopped in front of the ranch gate and called out loudly. Esperanza came out to the porch. Mateo appeared behind her, backpack still on because he had just returned from school. Sofa stayed inside with the rag doll pressed against her chest. I've come for the children, said Gilberto without greeting. Good morning, said Esperanza. Gilberto frowned. He gripped the papers he was carrying. I have documents from the courthouse. Mr. Vargas cannot provide a stable home for these minors. The minors eat 3 times a day, go to school, and sleep in a clean bed, said Esperanza. Their father works from sunup to sundown. If that isn't a stable home, Mr. Soles, tell me what one looks like. You are not family. You have no rights over these children. Don Aurelio appeared at that moment on the dirt road, as if he had happened to be passing by on his way to nowhere, which no one quite believed. Behind him came 2 women from the neighborhood, who also apparently had no particular business in that direction that morning. The notary looked at the newcomers. The man Gilberto had brought with him took a step back. Esperanza adjusted her shawl over her shoulders and descended the 2 porch steps until she stood at Gilberto's level, separated from him only by the gate. Mr. Soles, she said in a quiet, firm voice, your nephews have a father. Their father works every day from before dawn. These children have a bed, a fire, food, and prayers at night. If you loved your sister, honor her by caring for what she left behind, not by destroying what her husband built. Gilberto opened his mouth. He said nothing. These children, Esperanza continued, are the grandchildren of my comadre Remedios. I made a promise to Remedios many years ago, before either you or I knew what Alicia was going to need. God willing, Missed Souls, I am going to keep that promise. The notary folded his papers slowly. Without the father present, and without a judge having reviewed the case directly, he murmured, I can't do anything here today. Gilberto looked at Don Aurelio. He looked at the women who had arrived without anyone calling them. He looked at Mateo, who was still standing behind Esperanza with his back straight and his eyes fixed on his uncle, unblinking, with that look of a child who has made a decision he will not change. Gilberto lowered his eyes. This isn't over, he said. No, said Esperanza. It will be over when you decide that you love those children more than you hate losing the fight. Gilberto's souls left. The notary followed. The man from town whom no one knew well walked fast, as if he preferred that no one remember he had been there. Don Aurelio latched the gate calmly. Well said, he murmured. There are families made of blood, said Esperanza, and families made of presents. The ones made of presents last longer. Don Aurelio nodded. The neighborhood women did too. Doa Celia, who had arrived at the end and listened to everything from the side of the road, left without a word. In the days that followed, she stopped talking about Rodrigo at the market. Mateo came down the 2 porch steps and stood beside Esperanza. He said nothing. He just stood there, as if he had made a decision that didn't need words to be real. Esperanza felt his small weight beside her own. Something in her chest stopped hurting. That spring the ranch smelled different. It smelled of fresh baked bread coming out of the clay oven on Sundays, of pot coffee that Mateo now knew how to make on his own since Esperanza had taught him the steps, of freshly turned earth in the cornfield that Rodrigo had planted at the back of the property with seeds Don Aurelio had brought. The hens were laying well. The back garden had tomatoes, cilantro, and a patch of epazote that no one had planted and that simply appeared one day, the way good things tend to arrive when no one is looking for them. On Sundays, all 4 of them ate at the big table on the porch, with a checkered tablecloth that Esperanza only brought out for occasions. Sofa set the plates with great seriousness. Mateo carried the chairs. The children's laughter filled the porch in a way that Esperanza recognized at once, the way you recognize a language you learned as a child and thought you had forgotten. The silence of those walls, the same silence that 3 years before had seemed to have no bottom, had become, without her quite noticing it, another kind of silence. The silence of a house at rest, not a house waiting to die. The rag doll now had its fixed place on the kitchen shelf, next to Alicia's little recipe booklet that Rodrigo had retrieved from his house and placed there so the children could see it every morning. One Sunday, Rodrigo stayed behind after the children went to play on the porch. He set a mug of coffee in front of Esperanza before sitting down. You could have said no, he said. That first night, Esperanza wrapped her hands around the mug. Yes, I could have. Why didn't you? Esperanza looked toward the porch, where Sofa's footsteps and Mateo's laughter could be heard on the brick floor. Because God sends what you need in a way you don't always understand right away, she said, and because your daughter was sleeping with her arms crossed over her chest as if she were carrying the whole world. And that broke something open in me. Rodrigo didn't answer. He lifted the mug and drank. And in that simple gesture there was something that was no longer grief. Sometimes that's how the most important things arrive, without warning, at night, hat in hand, with two children who can't take another step from exhaustion. Sometimes the home you believed you'd lost forever is waiting on the other side of a door you haven't knocked on yet. And sometimes the loneliness of two people who don't know each other can dissolve into a single fire if both have the courage to stay beside it. Have you ever found a home where you least expected to find one? If this story touched something in your heart, leave us your comment. Tell us from which part of Mexico or wherever you're joining us tonight. Subscribe to the Stories Between Lives channel and turn on the bell so you don't miss a single story. Share this with someone who needs to remember that not every unexpected arrival is a misfortune. Until the next story. A heart-to-heart embrace. Sofa came running in from the porch with the rag doll raised in one hand. She planted herself in front of Esperanza and looked at her with that gravity of children who have thought something through for a long time before saying it. "I know what I'm going to call you," she said. Esperanza looked at her. "What, my love?" The girl lowered her voice until it was barely a voice at all. "Grandma."